Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 22 of the Argument Clinic. My name is Martin Sigalo, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host Lawrence, who will tell you his last name.
It's Zoe, pronounced Zoe.
Pronounced Zoe, so
Yes.
like oh, but like with a Z.
Yes. Actually, yeah. That's it.
Well, I do my best. So this is the Argument Clinic. This is a fundamentals podcast. Whether you are completely new to debate, whether you are a grizzled veteran of the tournament scene, whether you're a coach looking to instruct your students, this is supposed to be the podcast for you. All while providing a nice, good conversation full of nice, entertaining people and myself. Okay, so so where in the world have Martin and Lawrence been? Question mark, question mark. Lawrence, where have you been?
I was at the Golden Desert tournament last weekend. Quick
Was
fun
that in
story.
Florida?
It was not. It was in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Ah,
Um,
that would make more sense.
on the way back on my flight Monday morning, so I flew from Las Vegas to LAX, and while I was at LAX trying to fly back to Oklahoma, LAX lost power for 2 hours. So I just sat in an airport with basically no air conditioning, lighting, TVs, internet, power, nothing. That was really strange. I didn't really realize that airports
So
could lose
just like a
power for two
normal,
hours.
so just like a normal Tuesday for you.
It was a Monday, and no, because I usually don't get stranded at airports. I actually had to email my professor and be like, "Look, I don't think I'm going to be able to make my class today," but thankfully I did.
You made your class? Wow, tremendous. Well, I didn't have to fight against airports with no air conditioning. Instead, I just attended several local tournaments. We attended our state qualifying tournament here in Orlando, Florida, and our team did tremendously well, to my eternal happiness. And by that, I mean my happiness at that will never go away. It was really good. We qualified like 26 people or so, something like that. We had a lot of entries qualify. Definitely, really good showing for us and our tremendous kids in not just the Lincoln Douglas debate, but also in the speech events and stuff. And just I don't want to say yesterday, just Saturday, we had a local CFL qualifier at Lake Highland Prep. So mostly I was just running around helping to run that tournament, which was truly exhausting, but also very rewarding. So I've been really engrossed with the local debates for the past couple weeks. Now at the Golden Desert, you had a different kind of debate, mostly, I would say.
Yeah, mostly.
Okay.
I did some pretty a wide variety of debates. You got your typical like util style policy debates, Kant debates, as well as a debate that involved Curry's paradox on the affirmative and the Good Samaritan's paradox on the negative. So that was an exciting debate.
That sounds highly educational. Um, okay, so shout out to Stuart Swirsky, listener of the podcast um and local Central Florida debate coach that I see, and I saw him at this past CFL tournament. And another shout out to our sponsor, Victory Briefs. Lawrence, would you like to tell us all about Victory Briefs and why they're good?
Yeah, so thanks to Victory Briefs for sponsoring the podcast by providing the equipment and hosting support. Victory Briefs is a summer debate institute that is sure to improve your debate skills. You can learn more about camp this summer and their brief products at vbidebate.com. You should check out our LD and PF staff announcements that are on our Facebook page and stay tuned for more articles and announcements. And a special contribution they've made this week is a lot of this episode is adapted from the March-April brief packet, which will be released on the Victory Briefs website by the 15th of February. And nearly all of the evidence referenced in this episode can be found in the briefs. So that's exciting.
Good. Victory Briefs. It's great. Okay, so this episode is another scholarship episode. This is the topic analysis episode for the March April topic. We want to get this to you as early as possible because I know a lot of you, including us, have the state tournament very early in March. So we want to give you all ample time, those of you that are preparing for that. For some of us, the state tournament is the most important tournament that we will ever attend. And this is the topic that you will debate for that. And it's also oftentimes the topic for qualifying to nationals and stuff like that. So mastering this topic is certainly going to be very important. And we have a super secret special guest. It's super secret, even though you all know and we know. but it'll be if you haven't looked at the episode description, then it'll be a mystery to you for the next 2 minutes. Lawrence, how do you feel about the state tournament and its importance?
For me in high school, I think it was like the most important tournament usually of the regular season.
How many times did you win?
I won twice.
See, I wasn't expecting a real answer
Oh,
from
yeah.
that question, but guys, Lawrence is the best and still outperforms all my heightened expectations for him. I got second once and fifth one other time, and then the other time I didn't break. So, um, all right, when we get back, we will go into defining the words in the resolution, what the resolution means, and then we will go into other topics like arguments on the affirmative and arguments on the negative. Stay tuned. Welcome back from 5 seconds ago. We have an extra special guest, Elana Quint. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Oh, I'm so good. Lawrence, how are you doing?
Did you not ask that in the previous section? Oh wait, you didn't. I'm doing fine.
I did. You're doing fine. So we have a good. So we have two goods and a fine. That's great.
And a well.
And a well. Nice. Okay. Ilana. So you, of course, did Lincoln Douglas debate in high school. Now, where did you debate for?
I debated for Catalina Foothills High School, located in Tucson, Arizona, a city known for our bolo ties and dirt.
Yay! Both of those things. I know what one of those things is.
Which one? Bolo ties?
Dirt. I certainly know what dirt is.
Well, I'll have to get you a bolo tie for when the season finishes.
You really don't. Okay. So you debated in Arizona. That's a very interesting part of the country. And by interesting, I just mean I don't know anything about debate in Arizona. So now I do debate in Florida, and Lawrence does debate in Oklahoma. So together we span the East Coast, the middle of the country, and the West Coast? Question mark? Question mark?
Oh yeah, we consider ourselves West Coast sometimes. So
sometimes strategically when it suits you.
Depending on the weather, when it's warm, we consider ourselves West Coast. So that's most of the time.
Oh, good. Okay, so now, as I said before, we're going to get into the meat of the podcast, the juicy meat of the podcast. So the first thing what we're going to do in this segment is we're going to get into the resolution. What does it mean? And then in the next segment, we'll go over the arguments for the resolution and then some arguments against the resolution. But in this segment, we're just concerned with knowing what the resolution is, because if we don't know what it is, how could we even begin to debate it? Don't answer that question. So the resolution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the resolution for those of you that don't know it a couple of times slowly, so that we can all get a sense of what it is, and then we'll go into each of the words in the resolution, each of the important words one by one. So the resolution is: the United States ought to provide a universal basic income. Lawrence, do you mind saying that again for us?
The United States ought to provide a universal basic income.
Want to finish us off, Elana?
I would be happy to. The United States ought to provide a universal basic income.
All right. So send an email to the argumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com with which of us you found the most persuasive. And
you get bonus points for saying Elana.
You get absolutely no bonus points for saying Martin. That's just a given. And if you don't put Lawrence, he will hack your computer. Something. Okay, so the resolution. Now, some of the words in the resolution are very straightforward. So, for example, United States, the, to, a. We're not going to define those things. But let's go through in order. And there is some stuff that we should say about even simple words / phrases. So we have the United States. So the first thing I want to say about the United States part, and the only thing I want to say about it, is just that there are some literature that is not in the context of the United States, right, Lawrence?
There is.
So this topic being narrow to the United States does narrow a certain range of things that are appropriate on this resolution.
Yes, being that
So,
it has to be the United States. Boom.
yes. So what do you think is the utility of an argument that like studies or examples that are not from the United States are not topical, quote unquote? What do you think about that, Lawrence?
Not sure how persuasive that is, because like obviously the United States doesn't have a universal basic income, but it is being sort of tested and fielded in European countries. So to say that they're automatically disqualified because they're not US specific seems a little bit overgeneralizing.
Elana, what do you think about that? Do you think that evidence that is not written about the United States is still applicable on a topic that has the United States in it?
It's very useful to look at examples of how the UBI or similar programs have been implemented in the other countries because there's a lot of debate right now about the different ways that you can implement a UBI. And I think that we'll talk about those later. So using other countries could be helpful examples to kind of see what works and what didn't work.
Good idea. I agree with both of you. Okay, so next word in the resolution is a word that all of us are intimately familiar with, which is ought. It's important, of course, that this distinguishes one of the main things that distinguishes Lincoln Douglas from other kinds of debate, like public forum and policy, is that our evaluative terms have moral connotations. So ought doesn't just mean how many benefits do you have, how many benefits did you collect, does the resolution collect the most of those? Instead, it's also about philosophical things, about right, wrong, justice, etc. But to talk about this anymore would be a waste of time, as we all have this word in all of our resolutions. Okay, so provide a universal basic income. Let's start with universal basic income and then come back to provide, so that we understand provide through the lens of a universal basic income. So, Lawrence, what is a universal basic income? How would society look if we implemented one in general?
So I think there are 5 characteristics that characterize a universal basic income. So it's basically
Maybe before we like give a list of 5 things, we just have one very just general synopsis of what it is.
yeah, so it's a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without a means test. And so the 5 characteristics are basically just breaking down that definition. So
Okay, so Elana, do you want to massively simplify that for us?
The government gives everybody money for free.
Yay! Free money!
Free money.
Yes. And so what do you mean, Elana, for free?
Meaning that you don't have to do anything to get that amount of money. So usually when you get money, it's either because your parents want to give you allowance, or you have a job and you get paid by your employer because you did something useful for their business. But with UBI, you just kind of get money for existing, for being a citizen of that country.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So there's this word income. Now, Lawrence, in the universal basic income, what like in what contexts, in what other contexts, let's say, does income come about? Where do you normally get income?
from a job,
From a job. And the idea of a universal basic income is that you get income that is not from your job.
yeah. So I mean, like those 5 characteristics I was going to talk about will probably cover most of these issues in a pretty straightforward fashion.
Okay, go ahead.
All
Let's
right,
hear it.
so the first thing is it's periodic, which means it's paid at regular intervals, not as a sort of one-off grant. So it's not like everyone has won the lottery, you get a one-time payment of like $1 million and you're good to go. No, it's like you get it every month or every year, every a certain amount of time. But it's periodic, so it's got to be regular.
And that makes sense, right? If you think about it in the context of an income, right? It's like,
Yeah,
you don't just like start working for Microsoft and there's like, here's $3 million to spend over the course of the rest of your life, right?
Yep. Right.
Although that does seem very small for. And anyway, sorry. Anyway, what was number two?
Number 2 is the income part. It's got to be a cash payment, so it cannot be paid either as a service or food or voucher. So, for example, current welfare programs, for example, give food stamps, which you can give and redeem for food. This is not that. This is literally money. It is, you can spend it on whatever you want and is not dedicated to any particular use. You can spend it freely. So it's literal cash money.
So now, Elana, that would be distinct. So basically what that means is the government can't just be like, okay, Elana, you get universal basic income, except the only thing we're going to pay you with is avocados. You're just going to get only avocados.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, that would be good. But the point is that you could just say, hey, government, I'm allergic to avocados. I demand that you just give me a bunch of cash so that I can buy all the avocados or not avocados that I want. I would love to buy watermelon instead, or whatever. Something like that. Yes, yeah, okay. All right, Lawrence, what's number 3?
Number 3 is it's individual, so it's paid to every individual and not to households. So it doesn't matter if your household's 4 people, 6 people, 2 people, every person gets the same amount, and each individual person gets it. So as long as you're an adult, you get monies.
Okay, so as long as you're an adult, okay. I guess that like other things like, how many dependents you have would be covered in various other kinds of things that are not related to UBIs.
Yep, it does not matter. Zilch, zero, zada. All right, number 4 is universal. It means the universal part of the basic income is that it's paid to all without means test. And we were getting to this earlier that like there's no, well, actually, no, that's the next part. But a means test is just like a standard test. So, for example, most welfare programs are means tested, which means you only get it if you don't meet a certain threshold. So you fall this much below the poverty line, or you fail to take in this much income, et cetera, et cetera. UBI doesn't matter what you are, how much you make, et cetera, et cetera. You all get the same amount of money, and there's no means testing.
Mm-hmm. And that means that it not only goes to disadvantaged people in our society, but it could also randomly go to rich people.
Well, not randomly, like literally every rich person would also get it. So
right, yeah. The point is that it doesn't matter what your income is. The government isn't allowed to look at the income to figure out the money.
You can't look at the income to see how much money you get.
Okay, and what's the 5th one?
And finally, it's unconditional. And so this is the part that we were talking about earlier, which is that an income typically requires you to have employment for you to generate it. But the unconditional part of it means that there is no requirement to work or even to demonstrate willingness to work. So a lot of welfare programs are like, you have to show that you're like, for example, drug-free and looking to get a job. But this doesn't care. You can spend that money however you want. It doesn't matter if you're looking for a job, have a job, don't have a job, spend all of your day being a literal couch potato. It doesn't matter. You get the money no matter what.
So Elana, what's the idea with this as far as like, let's say like you're like a drug addict or whatever, and Elana, the drug addict,
oh goodness,
it's just like, oh goodness indeed, just like walks up and is like, hey government, like, can I have like my income? And is the government allowed to say no?
Even if you're a drug addict, you would still be qualified to get all of the money under a UBI. So the point is, and we'll kind of talk about this more when we discuss AF arguments, and that's the UBI recognizes that all people have basic human needs, right? People need to have money to buy food, money for medicine, for housing. And so even if you are a drug addict, you still have these basic needs. And hopefully they would use the money from a UBI to go towards those needs, although the government can't guarantee that.
Okay. So that's one of the things that distinguishes it from other major welfare programs then.
Exactly.
Okay. So Lawrence, I see you've written funding down here. This is also for a universal basic income. So maybe this is the time to talk about another word in the resolution, provide. So how would the United States provide a universal basic income? What do you think provide means in general, Lawrence? If I were to provide a universal basic income for someone, what does that mean and how would I do it?
Well, it means you just give people the cash. The question is more related to how do we do this, and more importantly, how do we get the money to do this? And this is like a pretty common negative argument that we'll sort of discuss, which is like, how do we fund this? But I think no matter which side of the debate you're on, you do need to take at least some time to think about how we come up with the necessary money to pay for this. And so there's a few different ways that you could deal with this. So number one is the most popular way that people have advocated for the universal basic income is as a sort of replacement for other welfare programs, and instead it takes over the entire welfare sector and it replaces all of them with a single program, the universal basic income. And so it takes all of the money from that and all of the saved money from the bureaucracy and the means testing and all of those other things and puts that all towards UBI. And so that's the most popular way of advocating for funding universal basic income. There's other ways of funding it as well. So people have proposed just like drastically raising the taxes on the rich to fund for the universal basic income. People have proposed, like rebalancing the checkbooks in terms of like military spending. People have proposed instituting a carbon tax, or
A carbon tax, really?
Yeah, that's a very popular proposal.
Seems awfully strange. Seems like go ahead. That's just really funny to me.
Well, it actually, like the Swarthmore Camp tournament finals, like the AF was like the funding mechanism is carbon tax, so the neg is like here's 5 reasons why the carbon tax is bad.
Yeah.
Which was
Yeah, I mean, like it's just like I'm just trying to imagine someone like in Congress today, right? And they're like, obviously this is a liberal person, right? And this person says, I would like you all to sign on to the universal basic income. And then like a lot of people, especially Republicans, are like, like maybe you convince them to do that. And then you're like, and the way we're gonna do it is a carbon tax. And then all the Republicans in Congress would be like, what? Just have this lefty thing fund this other lefty thing. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that was the sort of last common funding mechanism that people specified.
Actually, one of the most common ways that people have proposed funding is to tax machines, right? Because as the rise of automation comes, there might be the majority of jobs that will be actually done by machines. And so if we taxed them or the businesses that own them, then that could also create a lot of money for the UBI.
Wow, cool.
I've actually never heard of that, but I assume that's related to the class that you mentioned earlier that you're taking.
Artificial intelligence and the law.
Nice. So it could be a bunch of taxes where you take money from other people or from purchases and use that. And also you would take money from the government that it's distributing and just repurpose that money for this. Those are some of the common ways that it could happen.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So now to get back to provide a universal basic income. I feel like we have this conversation on a lot of topics, but does the word provide mean that the government has to, what would it mean for the government to provide you? You said the government just gives people the money. So
yeah, cuts them a check.
Is it as simple? So it's that simple. You get mailed a check.
Functionally, yeah. So currently, I think Finland's in the middle of a UBI experiment. That's basically what they do.
Huh. Okay. And I assume that other things accompanying tax rebates for the people that it would apply to, maybe that would work as well.
I'm unsure about that part.
But yeah, the thing that makes the UBI different from other welfare programs, of course, is that it's not that complicated in terms of you getting it. You don't have to jump through all these hoops. You just get given money.
Yeah, because the way that it happened in Finland is people just walked out to their mailboxes one day and they opened it up and there's a check for 2,000 euros or something in that.
I would like the occasional check for 2,000 euros.
Actually, no, it's 560 euros every month. Sorry, but the first check was a lot because it was several months worth.
What's that equivalent to in United States dollars? That's $5 every month or something.
560 euros is 650 or 680 USD, something like that.
Have you all ever seen euros? Just in real life?
I think so. I've been to Washington, D.C. They have a money museum. in the Smithsonian. So
Because I've been to like Europe a couple times and like I've just like seen it. It just looks like Monopoly money. Sorry if I'm just like offending a bunch of random Europeans who listen to the podcast. If you have an objection to the way that I have treated your currency, please send an email to the argumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com complaining about my conduct. But euros just like feel and look like Monopoly money. It's so weird. They don't feel real. It's I don't know, it's strange.
but then again, is money real anyway?
Good point. Question mark, question mark, question mark, exclamation mark, question mark. Is money real? You heard it here first. Elana doesn't believe in money. Lawrence, do you believe in money?
Yes. Like I just bought something today and I think it's real.
It's all just the exchange, the symbolic exchange.
Oh gosh.
Oh gosh, indeed. Oh gosh has been called. That's the abort lesson here on the podcast.
For
Okay.
those listening, we're not mentioning Baudrillard today.
No Bo Dillard will be mentioned. So, okay. Do you all have any observations about the resolution before we move on to our next segment about arguments? How was this resolution when it was debated? Did you all enjoy the debates? How did you feel that it was that it was balanced? What are some what are some common things, Lawrence, that we should be thinking about going into the next segment?
Oh, I like this topic a ton. So it's very reminiscent of the living wage topic from some time ago. What was that, like 2015?
I did not coach during that year, so I don't remember.
Okay,
I think it
so
was, yeah.
yeah, so very reminiscent of the living wage topic. This topic at camp was really fun. Like very few debates were sort of the same. I'm actually really sad that this isn't the Jan Feb topic because this is the one that's debated more frequently by people that travel around the country. And so I've already gotten a little bit tired of most of the plea bargaining debates. I feel like these UBI debates would be a lot better. But I'm looking forward to judging these locally. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of good clash on both the sort of philosophical level as well as forcing debaters to like learn a little bit about economics.
I think that it's okay. I like the plea bargaining topic more, for two reasons. One of the reasons that I like the plea bargaining topic is that I like learning about law stuff and like learning about the economy a lot less. So, although economics debates are interesting, I have a cultivated ignorance of all the different ways that you can be taxed. So this forces me to learn about taxes, and I don't like taxes. And not like from a policy standpoint. I just like don't like hearing the word tax. Um, and the second thing is that I feel like some of the conflicts on the plea bargaining topic, like a lot of the conflicts on that topic are legitimate conflicts of value, which makes it a good LD topic. And I feel like there's a bunch of conflict on this topic, but a lot of it is policy related. But we'll get into that in a second. But we're more interested in hearing Elana's opinion. Elana, what do you think about the resolution?
I love this topic because I think that you do get to talk about economics, but I think that this topic also gives a really unique opportunity to talk about ethics in the context of what does it mean to have an income? What does it mean to have labor? Do you have to work in order to get some kind of money, or do you deserve money just because you're a person and you have needs, right? And so I think that it brings an interesting question, maybe some assumptions that we have about kind of how a society should function, about what it really means to have labor. And so I think that it'll be really cool for some more framework heavy debates to happen.
That is some good optimism. I am happy to hear that. Okay. When we get to our next segment, we'll talk about 3 affirmative arguments that you all can use and respond to. All right, everyone, let's talk about affirmative arguments. Number 1, inequality. So, Lawrence, what is the inequality argument at its most basic level?
Well, I mean, basically that there is a massive gulf in terms of the amount of money and resources owned by the upper portion of society and the lower portion of society in America, where the rich, I'm sure like there's that popular saying is like 99% like or like 1% owns like I don't actually remember what the Sanders quote is, but something along the lines of like the 1% have too much money. Whatever, something like that. So all the rich people have a lot of money, all the poor people, and there's a lot more poor people that have a lot less money. So most of the wealth controlled by a very elite few, whereas only some of the wealth is then occupied by the rest of society. So the basic point of this argument is that UBI is a necessary solution to this problem of income inequality. And what it does is it just takes a bunch of money and functionally redistributes it so that everyone has a certain amount of money. And the way that it's funded is, of course, by the rich people getting taxed a bunch. And so functionally, the rich are just taking a bunch of their money and giving it to the poor in a very simple, fashion through the UBI.
Okay, so that was pretty good. Elana, I'm going to ask you a question about the things that an affirmative case that dealt mostly with inequality would be about. So I can kind of imagine this argument going one of two ways with the same kind of evidence. You could say either that the main problem in society is that there are people who do not have very much, and that makes their lives bad. Or two, the second way is that you can imagine it being a problem that there are people with so much more than the people who don't have that much. AKA, the problem is less of the situation of the people at the bottom and more of the gap between those people. So which of those things do you think that this argument is mostly concerned with? Is it concerned with just how bad things are for people at the bottom, or is it concerned with the gulf between the people at the bottom and the people at the top?
I think that there's a pretty good argument you could use to show that it's about the gap, because Mark Zuckerberg famously talked about this at the Harvard graduating class commencement to explore the idea of a universal basic income. And kind of his reasoning, and a lot of other very, very wealthy people who talk about a UBI positively, is that the gap between the people that have and don't have is so large and ever growing that it creates tension, and it creates what we would call class conflict. So people can't live harmoniously in a society together where there is such a big gap. So I think it might be very persuasive for debaters to talk about how people at the bottom can't have access to such basic needs, but I think that it's very interesting that you have people all the way at the top proposing a UBI because they see the value in having a society that has less inequality.
I agree. I agree completely. This affirmative, of course, you should talk at least a little bit about the plight of people at the bottom. But with this affirmative, I think the argument you're going for, and Lawrence, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that there is something especially bad by itself about the fact that the gulf is so big, regardless of the actual situation on the top or the bottom. The gulf in itself is the morally incorrect thing that should be eliminated.
Yeah, I mean that's the point, right? So the reason for like why the inequality and poverty arguments that we have listed here are separated is because this inequality argument could presume that everyone is not impoverished, that everyone is still living like a relatively okay life. But instead, this argument doesn't really care about that. It simply says that the gap in and of itself leads to some really bad things.
Mm-hmm. And it's not that they don't care at all about the plight of the people at the bottom. It's more of that's bad for a particular reason, right, Elana? It's that the reason that it's bad that the people at the bottom have it so poor is because it widens the gap.
Exactly.
Yeah. So ultimately, the way that I want to talk with you, Elana, about another sort of big issue here about this inequality argument. And I think it's also important to distinguish that there are two kinds of ways that you can run this case. So the first way would be the kind of way that Lauren set out, is you could say, well, the universal basic income would, in effect, reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, let's say. Which is to say that the UBI, just in its effect, would take a bunch of money from rich people and give it to poor people, so that if you then looked at the bar graphs, the bars of like rich and poor would be closer together than they would otherwise. And then there's another way of running it, which is a little bit more, you could say, deontological, or a little bit less concerned with consequences, less concerned with what would actually happen once we did the UBI, and is more just an argument that the principle of a UBI is consistent with the principle that people should be as equal as possible. Now, Elana, would you mind giving us kind of a sketch of that more deontological focused argument? How would you read this argument in such a way that you weren't just making arguments about the effects of implementing a UBI? That is there a way that you could do it by not having to go through the effects and instead just focus on the process of a UBI and kind of the ideal of it?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that if you wanted to run this argument in the way that you described, a little bit more focused on equality as a good, I think that using more of a Rawlsian framework would be a better way to explain that there's just something inherently, morally preferable about allocating our resources so that it helps the least well off. But if you're talking about running it more deontological, I think that a better argument, to phrase it more in that way, is just to say something like recognizing the humanity of people kind of as a basic ends, right? So a way that we don't treat people as a means and we recognize them as an end, as an autonomous person who has their own unique life and they have dignity, is that the government recognizes that by giving people sort of a baseline amount of money that they can use just to sustain their life, or right, to cover their basic needs like food or healthcare. That kind of shows that they as a person have some kind of value to the government.
Exactly right. And that would be a way of doing it that wouldn't depend only on whether or not a UBI would actually reduce the income inequality situation. Because the idea is that just the act of giving a universal basic income is the acknowledgement of the unique and important humanity of people. So Lawrence, if you had to pick one of those two ways of making this affirmative argument, which way would you personally suggest? I could see arguments for both. And after I get your opinion, I'll ask Alana's opinion.
Betraying my more utilitarian predispositions, I personally am like in favor of the type of arguments that are like economic inequality does things like reduce economic growth, it creates too much political power for the rich, it leads to harmful effects for those at the bottom, like all of those sorts of things. So I'm much more like in favor of the UBI is good on a sort of more consequentialist for a more consequentialist reason. And part of this intuition is in the fact that I think no matter what approach you take, you still at least have to partially justify that UBI would be at least somewhat successful at alleviating inequality, regardless of whether or not you took the more deontological or Rawlsian approach. So I think it's just better to be like, nah, here's the reasons for why income inequality is like bad, and UBI solves it.
Okay, so I will echo the opposite opinion. So it's not an echo, I guess. I will reflect I'm the mirror image of your opinion, Lawrence. I'm like what it is, except I'm like the opposite of it. That metaphor was bad. I think that the deontological approach is better just because I think that the negative arguments that are focused on utilitarian kinds of things are pretty decent. About whether or not a UBI would actually do things. So I think that from a strategy point of view, it might be better to make this argument deontological if you could swing it, because it is very difficult to argue that in principle a UBI is bad. It's much easier to argue that in practice it's bad. So making the debates about the principles rather than the practices, I think, is a good idea. Elana, we're right now it's 1-1. You are currently the third judge, so you get to make the all important decision. So what do you think?
Well, I'm gonna have to go in here and do an option 3, which is
Oh no.
think, yeah. I think that it depends a lot on which argument you want to go for, because I think that the most interesting argument under util has nothing to do with taxes, has nothing to do with economic growth, but really has to do with artificial intelligence. This is where me and my AI bias, that was a pun for all my AI nerds, it's coming through. But it's the idea that we have to face the technological reality that we're going to be replaced by machines, right? Machines are getting smarter, they're getting faster, and that they're going to replace almost 47% of our jobs over the next 10, 20 years. So UBI is kind of the only practical way that we can deal with that technological shift. But I also do see your point, Martin, about the appeal of a more deontological approach, that the idea of a UBI is a wonderful way for the government to recognize the humanity of their citizens and for people to kind of come together as a community and realize that there are some things that are more important than money, right? Like basic needs of health and food, and giving UBI can recognize that.
Okay, so so for all these affirmative arguments and negative arguments, where in addition to outlining the argument, which I think we've done pretty well by this point, we will also talk about how would you put the argument together and some ways of responding to the argument. So first things, how do you put this together? And for each one, it'll have two components, which is we'll talk about possible criterions and we'll talk about possible ways that you can research this position. So number one, criterions. So I think that something simple like respecting equality could be good. And I also think that some of the stuff that like Elana has said about respecting humanity, treating people as ends in themselves, perhaps if you're on more of a Kantian bent, which you talked about in a past episode. I also think that according to what Elana said, we could also do something on, let's say, something like Rawls. If you wanted to establish why inequality is bad, the Rawlsian veil of ignorance argument is pretty good, and we've talked about that on prior episodes as well. For those new listeners, Elana, would you mind just giving people a very, very brief sketch of what the veil of ignorance argument for helping the least well off is? What's the Rawlsian argument for why income inequality is inherently bad and should be resisted?
Sure. So John Rawls has an argument that's a thought experiment, right? It's called the veil of ignorance. So the idea is imagine yourself, but you're not yourself, right? You don't know your age, where you're from, your gender. You know nothing about yourself other than you're a person. And so the question that Rawls wants people to think about is, what kind of decision would you want to be made? And so the idea is if you're making a decision about how a government should act or how they should allocate resources, and you do so from behind this veil of ignorance where you don't know anything about yourself, Rawls kind of argues that you would be more likely to pick something to help the least well off. In the case that you were in that lower position, you would want to have kind of yourself taken care of. So that's the argument that Rawls uses as one of the ways to justify helping the least well off.
Okay. So it's kind of a very economically rational argument then.
Exactly.
That if you were trying to figure out the principles of justice you'd want in a society, you'd probably pick the one that has the least chance of screwing you over, and that one would be helping the least well off.
Yeah, it's a chance to step out your own shoes and think about it from a different perspective.
And Lawrence, you think that there could also be a utilitarian criterion, and with a contention focus on inequality, which would be something like inequality causes a lot of happiness and harms to the economy, etc. Right?
Yeah, it does a bunch of other bad things too. But yeah, utilitarian concerns for me.
Okay, so I feel like for researching this one, I feel like for the inequality kinds of arguments, you really do get the full swath of research on the topic. Like I can see, as Elana said, there are a lot of articles written by very like mainstream people, like Mark Zuckerberg, talking about why he thinks a UBI is good. So you might get some of that. Also, some of the philosophical literature in places like JSTOR could also be helpful. But inequality also lets you get into some of the more highly technical studies on Google Scholar articles. So really, the answer is everywhere. But Lawrence or Elana, do you all have any additional insights about places that you recommend people go for these kinds of arguments, like maybe specific articles or something like that?
I think that there's a really good background article from the LA Times. It's an op-ed entitled "The Case for a Universal Basic Income." So I guess you all can take your bets if you think this is a good AF or neg article. But this is a good article, gives you a lot of background information, a lot of good stats and figures. And I think it's a good starting point for anyone looking into the topic for the first time.
Okay, and Lawrence, do you have any advice?
Nah, it's like the most common, or it's like one of the most common arguments in the topic. Like you'll find it.
So pretty much the idea is that like if you collected a bunch of affirmative articles on the topic, right, and then you like arranged them on a very big dartboard and you threw darts, you'd like be bound to hit the inequality argument or something, right?
You'd have to be a very unlucky person to miss it.
To miss it, yeah. Okay. All right, so let's talk about responses to this position. So I have two responses listed here. I wrote one of them. Lawrence, you wrote the first one. What is it?
Yeah, so there is some academic debate as to whether or not it actually decreases inequality. So, for one thing, it depends on how you fund this mechanism. So, presume that, like, it's not funded through a more progressive tax structure, and it's instead just a reallocation of existing funds from, like, for example, the military, and everyone just gets, I don't know, like $2,000 a month. Well, if that's the case, how does it really reduce inequality, right? It seems like the only thing that's happened is that everyone has just gotten $2,000 more, but that doesn't reduce the inequality. There's still a massive monetary gap between the rich and the poor. So, if the affirmative is not very good about specifying how this is funded, particularly through progressive taxation scheme, it is very unlikely to reduce inequality. But even if it was funded through a progressive taxation scheme, there's a good chance that it wouldn't do that much to reduce inequality necessarily. There's some academic debate as to whether or not that might actually just give the rich more purchasing power to begin with, and that they're just going to get a little bit extra money that they can then spend to do things that poor people couldn't spend. So now poor people will use this money to buy basic social goods like food and water and stuff like that. But the rich people are just going to use this, particularly the middle class, are just going to use this to, like, for example, buy more influence in the political process, or increase their ability to influence legislation, or to buy things that would increase their social capital. And these are all things that might actually, in the long term, increase inequality.
Okay, that makes sense. I know that this is the debate that appears a lot in the literature of people saying like, "Oh, you UBI people, you're naive," in that tone of voice. And I think, by the way, it would be helpful to read all articles like for debate in a certain tone of voice. I think it would really get you all a sense of like how these people are like supposed to think about things. So, Lawrence, what's the tone of voice that you recommend for reading this argument?
Wait, what? There are different tones of voices that people have?
Yes.
Indeed. And I'm just saying, like, if you like had to give like I don't know, like a sound effect or something, like for articles like that would advocate the inequality argument. Just like
I don't do voices, so I don't really know what a different tone of voice is. I'm
Elana,
pretty sure I've
do you
talked in
want
the same tone
do you
through
want to
all 22 episodes.
that's true. Ilana, do you want to jump in here and help us out with a sort of fun tone of voice?
Yeah, this is where I'm glad for my middle school theater experience. It's going to come in handy in this moment. But let's see, if the goal is about reducing inequality, then you want to have like a, like, huh? That's a reduction of inequality. That's the sound. That's
That's the
going to
sound of
be,
inequality getting reduced.
yeah. If only were that easy, but.
What? Sounds like a Muppet.
Well, that's what inequality reduction sounds like, Martin.
Ah, yes. All right. Yes. Talk like a Muppet and you'll win all your rounds. That's a quote from Elana Quint. Okay, so Elana, other than asking you to do a voice, I also have a serious request of you, which
Oh, wow.
is which is so Lawrence kind of outlined this first argument, which is that this first argument against the inequality affirmative. The inequality affirmative says, about, well, we've described it in detail, but the way that Lawrence cast this objection is that the UBI might actually increase inequality. And Lawrence, true to his utilitarian bias, really talked a lot about the effect of a UBI on inequality, aka that purchasing power might not actually increase, or that it would be the same between all the different people. There would be the same gap. You would just shift the gap upward by giving everyone money. So I guess my question to you is the other way that I talked about, the one that was like a little more deontological, and I feel like you outlined pretty well. What do you think would be a response to that argument on the grounds of it increasing inequality? Put a different way, is there any way that is not directly tied to the effects of a UBI that might have it being counter to inequality? Because you can imagine the affirmative saying like, oh, well, UBIs are kind of good in principle, because what a UBI signifies is that everyone is equal and everyone means the same, and therefore it signifies that people are equal. Can you maybe think of a way that someone who is against UBI, but from this perspective, might argue that a UBI harms equality in principle? Or is there just not such an argument?
So one way that you can respond to the argument of an inequality UBIF is to do something a little bit more controversial, which is to argue kind of against the ethics of the UBI, which is that the process of universal basic income itself is unjust, which seems a little bit, confusing or not very persuasive, right? If a UBI is supposed to recognize people's equality and you're giving people money on the virtue of their humanity, then how can you turn that argument? And what you say is it's a way that you give money that does not respect the value or the autonomy of these people, right? Of the people getting the UBI. So this is an argument that's very means-based, because you're saying that the government is acting in a very patronizing way towards its citizens, that they are giving them free money and it seems to be without condition, right? But in some cases, there might be certain pressures or certain limitations that the money really is not able to be, spent freely. But also the fact that the government is giving it to their citizens creates this relationship where the government is the parents and citizens of the country are kind of dependent upon the government. And so the system of dependency is not only impractical if you want to go for more consequentialist impacts, but if you're going to keep it kind of a true deontic argument, then you can just say that the relationship between the government and the citizens is one that is dehumanizing and does not respect their autonomy.
All right, that makes sense. So let's move on to the second argument against the inequality affirmative, which is that equality as itself, as a goal, is not the end-all be-all of moral goods. Just because a world is equal doesn't mean it's good, and touting equality as always the moral good thing isn't necessarily a good value criterion. So this is a more framework-based way of attacking this, that a criterion that is more focused just on whether or not people are just the same all the time might not be beneficial. It's possible for things to be really equal between people and that equality to be bad. There's a sense of how a forced equality is one of the worst things at all. This is part of the objection that people have. So fundamentally, this affirmative is about the justice of a redistributive model of the economy, where you take money from the people that have it, you give it to the people that don't, and you kind of take the economy and you mold it into as equal as you can be, where equal means that everyone has the same thing. And there are people, from the more libertarian side, as Elana just mentioned, that have legitimate problems with that, but not just the problem of whether a UBI creates that good, but also just the problem of a society where your goal is to make sure everybody is the same, according to all the various social goods. So you will find a lot of people that think that this kind of vision of a society that UBI may or may not create on even the value criterion level is fundamentally unjust, or just the wrong way of thinking about things. Okay, are you all ready to move on to the poverty argument?
Ready as I'll ever be.
All right. The second argument that we have is poverty. And what I'll do first is I'll ask Lawrence for a very quick sketch of the argument in its more general sense, and then I'll get the robot take from Elana. Okay, so Lawrence, we have the poverty argument here, and like the inequality argument, this is an argument that you will come across when you are doing a very basic research. We spent a lot of time trying to distinguish the inequality argument from this above. The inequality argument, of course, was concerned about the plight of people at the bottom, but more as it related to the gap between those people and the really rich people. Now, Lawrence, how is the poverty argument different from that? I mean, from the name, it should be clear.
Yeah, so it could care less about whether or not a gap exists between the rich and the poor. It just cares that there are poor people and that poor people, if given money, would be less poor. And that is good. And that's basically it.
So it's concerned less with the gap and more with the plight of those at the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay, so and we'll talk about criterions in a second, but what is the main argument that UBI reduces poverty?
Right. So if a UBI correctly designed would ensure that any adult receiving a UBI, even without additional income sources, would be able to at least meet basic, like basic social goods. So they would be able to afford food, theoretically, and they would be able to like afford housing or some form of shelter, something like that. And so functionally, it would eliminate almost all of poverty in the United States because you would just get as much money as you would need to not be poor. That's it.
Yeah, and um, one of also two ways of thinking about it is one is you could think of the harms of poverty being like, well, the idea is that there is a poverty line, and we want as many people to be above it as possible, and it could be because being below the poverty line is on average bad or not. And then another thing is related to um is not so much whether people are below or above some random line, but is more just that people live in bad conditions now, and anything we can do to make those conditions better would help. Is that kind of a good way of looking at it, Lawrence?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Now, Elana, you mentioned knowing a lot about our future robot overlords, and how they figure into this topic. So, how does the poverty argument intersect with the sort of the new rise of machines and automation and taking people's jobs? How is that related to poverty in general?
So this argument talks about how the advancement of AI or new technology is going to replace a lot of low-paying jobs or even decently paying jobs in the US. And so people that currently don't have to worry about their income will have to worry in as soon as 10 years, definitely by 20 or 30 years. So the idea is that we need to start thinking about implementing UBI now, right, sooner than later, to kind of prevent that problem from happening before it's too late. And so the way it intersects with poverty is that people that were no longer having to worry about, basic necessities are going to lose their jobs to technology, and they'll need a UBI kind of as a solution.
And part of the idea is that for other kinds of ways that people lose jobs, they can do other kinds of jobs. But I think that the whole automation stuff, and you are maybe more qualified to talk about this than I am, but my understanding of the automation stuff is that we are moving towards a entirely different kind of society, where these kinds of jobs, where there just will be less and less jobs for people to do those kinds of things, just at all in the future. That there will be more humans than there really exist jobs for them to do. Is that accurate, or did I just bungle that?
Well, it's actually pretty accurate. So if you look at technological revolutions kind of throughout, world history or US history, there has been, a pretty large group of people that every time there's some kind of new technology, or every time there is a threat to a loss of jobs, people freak out, right? So if we look at really good example would be the Luddites, right, who famously smashed machines and technology. And so every time that there's been sort of a big scare about how technology is going to replace jobs, we found that empirically, kind of as many jobs that were lost from this technology were also created. So one of the wonderful traits about being a human is that we're resilient and we're open to adapting. And so whatever technology happens, we're always going to adapt to try to find new jobs. So some people will still argue that this might be that technological revolution where that doesn't happen, where people can't really adapt because AIs are going to sort of outsmart us and make it such that we don't have any utility. We're kind of useless human beings compared to these machines that are smarter and faster than us. So that's something that we'll have to find out ourselves. That's kind of our generation. We're going to experience that, but there are arguments on both sides.
Okay, so I guess just one last question about the robots for now is, in order to make this argument when you are affirmative, how deep in the we're totally going to get destroyed by robots in all areas of our lives, how deep do you need to get into the predictive elements of that in order to make this argument? Could you make the very serious version of the argument where you say, oh, well, society is going to be fundamentally different. There just will not be enough jobs for people, and therefore we'll just need a universal basic income to ensure that not everyone's going to starve to death when there's no jobs to go around. You could obviously make the very serious version, but could you also make a less serious version that just says, hey, machines are taking some of our jobs, some of those people are poor, let's try and reduce that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And if you look at the statistics, right, the one that I mentioned earlier from the LA Times, it's not a small amount of jobs that are being lost, right? It's almost half of jobs, 47%. So I think you can make a very, reasonable, more moderate argument that we have to kind of face the reality of technology and that a UBI is a way to do that.
Okay. Now let's talk about criterions. Lawrence, what are two criterions that you could recommend for the poverty related affirmative or position?
Yeah, so the first is everyone's favorite criterion in debate, minimizing structural violence. There's a lot of people that are like, poverty is a form of structural violence because it's structural in nature, in that it affects a lot of people and is mostly, or at least partially, due to the way that structures and economic systems exist. And it causes forms of slow violence against people. So obviously, people who are impoverished will face starvation, suffering, lack of access to healthcare, they'll die early, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure everyone has heard of all of the common minimizing structural violence cards that justify the criterion, like our favorite Winter and Layton cards. Although I think they've been recently falling out of favor, thankfully. We'll see. So that's, I think, probably the most popular criterion with this.
I think that I think not I just don't want you to necessarily sell this short. Isn't poverty the example of structural violence?
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. So when people are like structural violence and they refer to a lack of access to some institutional good, so typically like healthcare or something, none of that is nearly as bad as just like straight up being poor, because that means that every possible good that can improve your life is out of your life, and that anything that is potentially bad means that you have functionally no recourse from it. So,
Well, that's true, and those are of course reasons that poverty affects people negatively. But poverty is certainly the quintessential example of a violence that we don't notice because it's so slow, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
The idea is that there are certain harms that are generated not just from the government, acting on people directly, of course, in a very sort of totalitarian thing, but also violence that just happens just by the systems that we live in just existing normally, in kind of normal violence that's become acceptable and normal, not because they don't generate massive harm, but just because that harm isn't maybe on the same visual register that we normally associate with harm, and because our society has put us in the position where we don't see that violence as being violent even in the first place because it happens so slow. Now, poverty is the quintessential example of exactly that situation where huge segments of the population live in daily violence. So the forms of so this is this is consequentialist in the sense that this criterion is obviously focused on the results of our actions, but it's not it's sort of utilitarian, but not exactly, because it says, of course, utilitarian harms are problematic, but it is important that we focus on slow violence so that we have sort of an appropriate way of looking at violence, because otherwise we might miss it. So that's the first one of structural violence. Will you lead us into the second one, Lawrence? Does it start with a U?
Yeah, it's my favorite criterion of all time. It's utilitarianism. So if the
You
point,
said that so despondently, but I think that's true, right?
Oh yeah, no, it is actually my favorite cartoon of all time. Like
It's been a
I'm not
long.
lying. Like when I'm just like, yeah, this betrays my utilitarian predispositions because it's like, no,
You're just
I
like,
hold
oh, util, it's my favorite. It's like, yeah, it's your favorite.
it is. It's great. Uh, at least in debate. So like, if we care about other people and we care about their happiness and we care about their suffering, well, a bunch of people, and there are a lot of people who are impoverished in America, are suffering. And so, independent of whether or not we prioritize slow structural violence that like affects certain people and excludes them from our calculation, et cetera, the utilitarian is just like people are poor and that is bad. The end.
Yeah, it makes them hurt.
Yep. It makes them sad. Sadness is not good under utilitarianism.
Indeed. Okay, so for research, I think that a lot of the stuff that we said above about the inequality af would be where you go here, which is that it would be difficult not to find this argument. You would have to try very hard to not come across the poverty argument when you're researching the resolution. One question I have for you, Alana, about the robot stuff is if people wanted to read more about that automation stuff, um, other than maybe that LA Times article, or I guess if the answer is just that LA Times article, then go for it. But um, where do you recommend people go to research this artificial intelligence stuff? Should they want to incorporate it into the poverty argument?
Best place to get evidence on kind of AI or emerging technology is Google Scholar, right? That's where I got a lot of my sources. Or you could email my professor, and he'll send you a lot of very useful PDFs. In fact, if I can, maybe I can attach some of them to the podcast somehow, or give those links or references. But the best place to find this information is Google Scholar, and just using the right search terms, you'll find all the articles you could ever want and more.
I don't know about attaching it. That'll probably be difficult. But what is your professor's name?
Dr. Marchant, Arizona State University. He's actually a professor at the law school, not for undergrads, but you could still try to reach
Can you
out.
can you can you spell that for the little and big kids at home?
Yeah, so let me make sure that I got this right. So his last name is Marchant, Marchant. He's a professor at Arizona State University, greatest state in the United States, if I must say so myself.
With the possible exception of Idaho.
I, exactly. You get it, Martin.
Oh yes. I'm quick on the uptake. Okay, so responses to the poverty argument. Lawrence, what's the first one?
So there, like, while it seems kind of obvious that you're like, here's some money, now you're not poor, and that solves all the problems. Well, the issue is like it might actually make people worse off than they currently are. So currently, the United States has a bunch of different targeted social programs that target different aspects of poverty, and it tries to address them differently. So, for example, some people, can get housing, some people get food stamps, some people get, like cheaper. I don't know, other things, whatever. The point is that there's like dozens of overlapping and different targeted social programs, which a UBI would probably eliminate and get rid of a lot of these targeted social programs. So people that were, first of all, like relying on food stamps and relying on a bunch of other things to like help make their housing cheaper, now might actually see a reduction in the amount of money that they get from the government, because instead of getting functionally what is worth like maybe $6,000 in terms of vouchers, food stamps, etc., they now only get $3,000 a month from the government. Well, they're seeing their money functionally go cut in half. And there's good evidence to indicate that there's like not a good chance that the UBI would actually provide you enough money to like live a relatively decent life, just one that's like barely above like the sort of poverty line. And that doesn't actually really seem to address the root issue of poverty if we get rid of all these social programs that do better things that currently.
So I think that that's Alana. I think that that's the key question from what Lawrence just said, which is the whether or not the programs are better. So do you have any sense of what or would a reason be for why the targeted social programs are better than the kind of mass targeted giving people a bunch of money?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that that's probably one of the harder questions to answer with this topic, because is a lot of conflicting data about this. So a lot of people that are very passionate that believe that targeted programs are ineffective, right? They're the ones that are the strongest advocates that we use that funding from those programs and all of the bureaucracy associated with it, and we take that funding and we put it toward UBI. But there are some people that think that would be a disaster, right? The point is that welfare programs are supposed to target the people that need help the most. And if we don't do that and we have more generalized programs where people are, free to spend money however they want to, right? Not only do we possibly have less funding for people that need it the most, but also we can't guarantee how that funding is being spent. And so we can't guarantee that people are going to kind of use that funding responsibly or to help their needs, which sounds very patronizing. So for those people that like that argument, here's another place to apply it. But I think it's a pretty tight debate on this question.
Okay. Sounds good. Now let's talk about the second argument. This is one that I wrote down. So I think one of the easy arguments against the poverty thing is just that poverty is affected by a large number of different things. And one of those things is obviously the strength of the economy. So if one of the arguments that we're making, and as we'll talk about in the next segment, it will be that the economic strength is harmed by the introduction of a UBI, I think that certainly a failing economy results in more poverty in pretty much every case. So this is kind of a proxy for a large section of negative arguments, but the second way of responding to this affirmative case is with your negative case. If your negative case, whatever your contention argument is on the negative, it almost definitely impacts the economy in a negative way. So you can definitely argue that the economy will get worse as a result of, if you can win that the economy will get worse, you can win that poverty will go up. Or if whatever the other negative arguments you have, you can certainly argue that those would affect poverty in some way. Okay, any reason to not move on to the third argument, everyone?
I'll throw in one quick addition to this econ argument, and we could relate it more specifically to, for example, unemployment. So maybe if the UBI causes an increase in unemployment specifically, that might make people worse off, because then people would lose their jobs that they otherwise had, and that would put them in a worse overall state. And I think that specifically would be a good example of the economy affecting poverty rates.
Now let's move on to the third argument, which is freedom. And I think that this argument is related to how having a universal basic income allows people to, make their lives what they want, what they want them to be. So Lawrence, what is this argument?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different variations of it, and I'll quickly jump into three, and I'll make them really short and simple. So the first is sort of the Kantian political philosophy perspective. So our favorite Kantian author, Arthur Ripstein, has this point in his book, Force and Freedom, which talks about how economic dependency violates freedom, and that if you don't have a universal basic income that is guaranteed to you regardless of whether or not you have employment, well, you're subject to the whims and wills of those with more power or more economic power than you, specifically your employer, and that makes you unfree. And so being at the mercy of others and living in a state of constant dependency makes it so that you have no freedom. And so the Kantian version of political philosophy would say, no, you shouldn't have to live like that. Here's a universal basic income, be free. The second version of this argument is sort of civic republicanism, and it follows in relatively similar veins, which is just dependency is bad. But the way that they phrase it here, or the author that is commonly cited, which is Philip Pettit, talks about the civic republicanism cares about non-domination. And so it's basically the same thing, which is that to be subject to the whims and wills and the power of another person makes you unfree. And so the civic republican, who cares about freedom as a sort of positive type of freedom and the ability to do what you want and be free from the whims and wills of others, would say that a universal basic income would be really good. And then the final version of this argument is the libertarian strand of freedom. And their argument is that imperfect market mechanisms will allow some people to slip through the cracks, and they're going to be unable to participate in the market. They're unable to seek employment and contribute to the economy, et cetera, because of things that were really outside of their outside of their ability to control. And so giving everyone a UBI ensures their ability to freely participate in the market and start from a relatively equal starting point. And that is key to allow people to live their lives how they see fit, away from how other people are trying to direct how their lives occur, and preventing them from getting arbitrarily excluded from the market.
Yeah. If you had to like pick, or do you think that all of those are kind of equally viable ways of putting this argument, or do you think that there are multiple?
In terms of debate strategy, the Kantian political philosophy, the Kantian political philosophy one is like, I think, the most philosophically interesting, and it's going to invite a lot of good clash over Kant's philosophy and whether or not we should take his political or moral philosophy. I think the civic republicanism stuff is actually, I think, the strongest, because there isn't most negatives are not as familiar with what this brand and strand of philosophy say, so they're going to be less able to sort of clash heavily with the app. And the libertarian version of freedom, I think, is really good, just because it directly preempts the most common negative argument on the topic. So if you read this version of the freedom argument, then you're like ready to have a debate on the neg's own ground and beat them at their own game. Personally, I would recommend the libertarian strand of freedom, but only not because I think it's the best version, but only because in a debate sense, it like functionally takes away the neg's best argument, I think, on the philosophy side.
Now, one important feature of this, though, is that the ones that don't have to do with civic republicanism, those do rely on a very particular and developed experience with Kant already.
I mean, I don't think you need to be like.
I mean, you did recommend to people that they read Force and Freedom.
Well, yeah. I mean, like, I think you need to read at least like a chapter or two. Although, in fairness,
that is pretty involved. I think you're right. I just think that we should acknowledge that not all of our listeners have read Ripstein.
Yeah. The Kantian argument is definitely a little bit more difficult to grasp. The civic republicanism stuff, like the article is not that long, and the Philip Pettit stuff, the cards alone, I think, make the argument well enough that I don't think you need to reread the argument. And these cards will be in the briefs, of course. And then the libertarian version, like, you can find short articles of this all over the internet.
Now, I just want to make it clear to our audience, though, you don't have to have read multiple pages of this Force and Freedom book to get a sense of what this first version of the freedom argument is. It's very simple. It's just that if you are in a position, serially, where you can't do the things that you want to do, you aren't really free in a real sense. Is that just the argument, Lawrence?
Yeah, like, basically.
Yeah, so ultimately it is a particular view of freedom, but don't feel like you need an absurd amount of knowledge in order to justify it. Okay, Elana, so if you wanted to put this together, what are some kinds of criterions that you would recommend, and how would you research it?
Well, I think that this is a great argument, and I'm looking forward to judging a lot of debates where people will run whatever version of this argument. So if you're looking for a good criterion, something about protecting autonomy, or respecting liberty, something that allows you to discuss on a more philosophical level why we care about things like autonomy and freedom, right? Because even if people are living a good life in a world, let's say with or without a UBI, it's really the concept of what it means to be free and independent over, the comfort of what an additional boost of income would mean.
Mm-hmm. So it's less about it's less about how happy you are and more about whether you can do things.
Exactly. So that's why picking a criterion that's a little bit more simple, right? Something like autonomy or liberty is good, because it gives you a chance to talk about why it's so important to live life according to your own reasons. And this is a really strong, framework argument, because it doesn't matter how good your life is, kind of quote unquote good. It's about you being able to live according to kind of your own reasons. And that's really what morality is. It's about you making decisions that you wanted to, not something that you were limited to or coerced to. So I think that having a more simple framework would help you accomplish that.
So, am I wrong about this, you two? Doesn't autonomy literally mean like self-rule, like in the Greek or whatever?
I don't speak Greek, but I do have a computer. I can look this up.
Ah, I too have a computer. Well, let's just assume that I'm right because I'm so smart. And if I'm wrong, please, please just send an email to the Argument Clinic at the Argument Clinic podcast at gmail.com with just the heading "You are wrong" and then no text, and I'll understand what you mean. Okay. How would you research this argument, Elana? Would you wouldn't be looking at like random news articles, would you?
Oh, no, no, no. So the best place to start if you want to look up a good framework for autonomy or freedom or liberty is start at a place called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So all you have to do is go into Google and type that in, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it will bring you to a wonderful website where you can kind of Google terms like liberty, autonomy, freedom, and you'll get to read about these philosophical theories. And in addition to that, whatever article or segment you read will also have a lot of very useful links and sources you can follow up for more, framework and philosophical evidence you could use.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, Lawrence, responses to this argument. Number one, go.
So number one is there's a strong debate as to like what type of freedom people really mean when they're talking about freedom. And a lot of these types of freedom presume a sort of more positive version of freedom, which is like the freedom to do things versus a negative type of freedom, like the freedom not to have things done to you. And the primary philosophical clash here, I think, that people will latch onto in debate rounds is this distinction. And a lot of these affirmative versions of freedom are like, we need the freedom to live life as we see fit. So we need the freedom and the ability to do things. Whereas a lot of the negatives, I think, are going to latch more onto this negative freedom stuff, which is like, but taking property away from other people is unjustified. And there's going to be a lot of debate between those two concepts. And the negative is just going to be like positive freedom doesn't make sense because it requires a violation of negative freedom. So that is going to lead sort of to the libertarianism stuff that we'll talk about later.
Okay, so and the second response to this kind of case is the idea that how free people are is affected by a lot of things, including things that are not directly in your control, like the economy. So these are kind of consequentialisty responses, but they are responses that you should be making, which is that if the economy goes south and all of the negative effects that people talk about for implementing the UBI, those could very easily have the effect of limiting the options of people or limiting your autonomy. Your set of choices might go down drastically if you are harmed in some really tangible way. So that's a way of responding to this without needing to get into a super deep criterion debate, although of course you could certainly have that. You could challenge the idea that freedom is the most important thing in the first place. And this, of course, a very classic, Lincoln Douglas debate. You have the like autonomy versus welfare debate a lot of the times, and you can, of course, have that on this topic. But if you wanted to get on the top, debate about the substance of the universal basic income and the effect that it has, you could argue that those effects have pernicious effects on freedom as well. All right, when we get back to our next segment, we'll talk about negative arguments in much the same way that we've been doing so far. Negative arguments. Before we get into the 3 negative arguments segment that we'd normally do, we thought it would be a disservice to you all, not to mention one very important thing about being negative on this topic, which is that a lot of the times the negative will argue about alternatives to the universal basic income system. And this is kind of an acknowledgement of the situation where it is easy to say that the universal basic income is better than nothing. But a lot of times the negative will argue that the question isn't whether the UBI is better than nothing, but whether it's better than some other things that we might do instead. which is to say, and the purpose of this is to kind of mitigate the affirmative's ability to argue that the negative is just passively doing nothing, where the negative says, instead of doing nothing, we should, try and fix poverty and all the other things that the affirmative cares about. We should just go about it in a completely different way. Now, Lawrence, you've written down some examples of alternatives to the universal basic income that the negatives that negatives on this topic could bring up. So what are some of those?
Yeah, so I'll just discuss a few of the popular ones and like briefly talk about reasons for why the UBI might be better. This won't be particularly in depth because we encourage you to do the research about this separately. So first one, most popular one is the living wage counterplan. So instead of guaranteeing everyone money regardless of whether or not they work, it just means that everyone who does work indexed to relative to where you live would receive enough money so that if they worked a full-time job, they would be like living pretty good life. And this is a popular counterplan for a bunch of reasons, but probably most notably because there's tons of prep over it, given that it was the 2015 Jan-Feb topic. I think it was 2015. I'm not entirely sure, but there's tons of prep over it for why the living wage is good, for why it solves poverty, for why it does a lot of good things. But at the same time, a lot of the benefits of a UBI might be distinct from the things that living wage is able to do. So if you, for example, talk about overall poverty, well, it doesn't seem like living wage can capture the ability to alleviate poverty for those who don't have employment. And for inequality, it seems like living wage, again, doesn't necessarily help those who are unemployed. So that's a counterplan to be aware of. Next counterplan is a pretty popular one. It's called the job guarantees counterplan. So instead of guaranteeing everyone money, regardless of whether or not they work or try to seek employment, the job guarantees program simply says that everyone is guaranteed a job. So whether that be a sort of public job by working for the government, and some of these proposals even include the ability to like work for a federal program to like sort of make the world a better place. It's a bunch of different things, and then you get paid a relatively good wage as a result of that guaranteed job. And the reason this might be preferable to a UBI is because, well, we want people to be working, and a UBI might encourage people to not work, and that might hurt the economy overall. Job guarantees may not be better than the UBI because not everyone can seek a job. So like what happens to those who are, for example, disabled? And there's also a question of like, what does it mean to guarantee people a job, or why that even means that you can't have both a UBI and a job guarantee. Final counterplan that we'll discuss is the near universal basic income. This is a single paper that someone wrote somewhere in 2010, and for some reason people are still talking about it. It's basically you give people a UBI, except you don't give the rich a UBI. So like the top like 1% don't get money. And obviously this saves a little bit of money and solves the vast majority of the things that the affirmative will talk about, like inequality, poverty, freedom, et cetera, et cetera. This might not be good because one, it still requires means testing, and there's lots of reasons to think that that might be bad. And second, there's no real reason for like why you would ever implement a program like this. Like the saved money is very, very tiny, but the risk of like making rich people angry and like this benefit that it incurs over the sort of decreased efficiency that it incurs seems like not super worth the trade-off. So there's questions about this counterplan. There's about like 30 other counterplans that exist because obviously it's a complex economic question and there's myriad of proposals to solve this. But these are the alternatives that will be, I think, most frequently proposed by debaters.
So I want to talk about, so you use the word counterplan a lot, and on this podcast, we have not gone into exactly what that is. So, so I just want to very quickly mention the way that I think that these alternative arguments will present themselves in debates. Now, there are two ways that that you could offer an alternative, so to speak, for this. So, or kind of two ways that you could incorporate these arguments into your negative cases. So, number one is you could read it as a quote unquote counterplan, and where the basic argument would be, you assume that the affirmative offers some plan of action, which in this case is just the resolution. And you would provide a counter proposal, a counter plan, or something that says that we should do a different thing instead of the resolution. And then at the end of the day, you would compare the resolution to that counter plan rather than to just doing nothing. And that would feature its way prominently as a major, focus point in the case. And then the other way of arguing it is not to necessarily say, this is the only thing that I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about this one counterplan. You could also just say, the fact that these other alternatives exist to the universal basic income proves that the universal basic income is not perfect, and that if there are other viable ways of implementing non-poverty schemes, we should do those instead if we think that the universal basic income is bad. So one of the ways, the second one, is kind of like as a foil to the universal basic income. If I was able to show you that there are about 50 different things you could do that would be better than a universal basic income, I think it would be, foolish to think that we should do it. So you can run this as a counterplan, should you so choose. If you think that that's wise, you know what a counterplan is, and you kind of know the judges in your area and whether they'd be good with this. Or two, you could read it less as a counterplan and more as as proof that the universal basic income isn't all that it's cracked up to be, as shown by the fact that there are a bazillion other things advocated by economists that are preferable. Okay, so Elana, do you have anything to add to this discussion of alternatives before we get into the major negative arguments?
I mean, I think that the only thing is that if you are a debater and you're facing one of these alternatives, oh, good. Well, then you're eligible for this comment. But if you are facing one of these alternatives in round, don't let that intimidate you, right? Especially when you're first debating counterplans. And on this topic, where it's so, heavy on economics, you might think that you need a lot of background to be able to respond. So the best advice that I have is look at some of the most popular options that Lawrence talked about and just try to see, what kind of answer you can give that, relates to your affirmative case, but doesn't maybe get you, too deep in the weeds of the specifics of it. So point is, don't be intimidated by these other alternatives and try to come prepared with a response as best you can before the tournament.
At our time at VBI, Elana, these were pretty popular, right? These,
oh yeah, they were very popular for people of all experience levels from all different parts of the country. So I would expect to see some of these for sure.
Definitely. And, we at the Argument Clinic podcast are not telling you what style of debate to have, but we are saying that regardless of the style of debate, we found, based on our experience, that people will be making these alternatives arguments almost regardless of the kind of debate that they're having, just because they're very popular. Okay, so now let's get into the negative arguments proper. So the first thing we have is a topic that we've already seemingly discussed ad nauseum, which is libertarianism. So Lawrence, I'd like you to give me maybe not a complete sketch of the argument, because we've already talked about it at length before, but the libertarian line of argument on this topic is primarily concerned with property rights. So Lawrence, what is the property rights libertarian argument that we maybe haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, so this is an argument that for some reason finds like a lot of grounding in Nozick, which is just that you own your labor, which means that you own the fruits of your labor and the things that you've earned by doing things. And you own your money, and that taking away the fruits of your labor or the money that you've earned from doing a job is functionally a violation of your property rights and akin or almost similar, or at least in the same moral vein as theft, or even to some degree partially forced slavery, where they take away the money that you've earned by threat of force and violate your property rights. And that's basically just the argument here, that redistributive taxation, or taking away of your property for the use of other people that isn't sort of a social good that is guaranteed by a minimalistic government, is a violation of property rights.
So I think that all of us, or at least the vast majority of us, have taken some kind of American history class related to stuff like, the American Revolution and why that happened and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of us also just have people that they know or are one themselves that know people that say this kind of thing in response to, government, reach or overreach or whatever. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is a very common argument, not just in debate, right? This is a very, very common point of view, Elana, just from like a normal philosophical perspective and political perspective and historical perspective, which is to say, this argument should be very familiar to us generally.
Oh, absolutely. We could have an entire podcast series just on this argument alone. Because it is so, common and popular, not just on this topic or even this season of debate, but it's come up in the past. It will come up again. It's probably one of the cornerstones of our, debates, even as citizens of this country. So definitely pay attention to this argument for future topics too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely, especially the narrow economic side of things about redistributive taxation versus versus just kind of letting the economy shake out and do what it should. Okay, so how to write this? So number one, of course, is criterions. So Lawrence, if you had to pick just some easy text for criterions for this position, what would you do?
I've got a few in mind. So if you want to take a more Zickian stand, you can just say sort of consistency with a minimal state and just be like the minimal state is only justified in protecting people's negative property rights. Any violation of that is a greater government that infringes upon negative property rights is, functionally government that has too much power and is immoral. You could say the standard is sort of like respecting freedom and make arguments for why this violates the freedom of people. You could say the standard is sort of rejecting coercion, which is like, using coercive power to take away property from others to just redistribute is coercive and immoral. And finally, you could sort of take a more Kantian stand here, which is that like you could say respecting people as ends in themselves, and make the argument that taking the property rights away from one person to give to another for their for the other person's benefit is functionally treating the person you took the property from as just like a mere means for the benefit of other people, and that violates their fundamental moral worth.
And if you wanted to research this, Google Scholar, JSTOR.
Yeah, although most of the libertarian property rights cases against living wage are, I think the better articles are just found on the sort of libertarian blogs. So like Cato Unbound, libertarianism.org, et cetera, et cetera. All of these people have, these sites have just like way too many essays about the universal basic income and about redistributive taxation in general. And I find these to be sort of better for debate purposes because they're easier to read since they're written for the sort of lay audience, whereas the more deep philosophical journals that you might find on JSTOR are like a little bit more complicated to disseminate and dissect.
So what are the names of maybe some of those places you think, like the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation? Like there's some
Cato Unbound, Cato, libertarianism.org is for some reason a very surprising source of libertarian material, believe it or not, and not Rawlsian literature. And just like Googling around, like people on blogs have just like tons of articles here, like philosophy professors that adopt the more libertarian tradition will write on their sort of personal professional blog about universal basic income. It's pretty easy to find. I don't think anyone will have any trouble finding these arguments.
I remember actually on the draft topic, the compulsory service topic, there were a lot of like libertarian arguments on these blogs that were like extremely well written and extremely good, and there are people debating with each other even on the same blog about those things. And universal basic income stuff, goes to some of the same sources, and there are a lot of really well written articles there. Okay. So let's talk about responses to libertarianism. So number one is listed as true libertarianism. Lawrence, what does it mean for libertarianism to be true?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what you mean by true libertarianism, but there are a few reasons for why libertarians might consider instituting universal basic income. So number one is just sort of a practical libertarian case. Most libertarians recognize that you're not going to get able to get rid of the entire welfare state, and they think the welfare state is bad for a bunch of reasons, like it's inefficient, it creates worse outcomes for people, and most importantly is it violates a lot of negative property rights. So they think that if they could convince people to institute a UBI by eliminating all other social services and programs, that would be, in the end, a better world for libertarians because there would be less welfare programs. because there'd only be just one, and it would result in less violations of property rights. So sort of the pragmatic libertarian case for redistribution. A second popular libertarian argument is the argument that I mentioned above, which is in the AF freedom section, talking about how markets are sort of imperfect, and as much as libertarians want to think that they're perfect, most libertarians will concede that there are market imperfections, which makes it difficult for people to compete in the market in the first place. And so you can use that argument here as a response to this libertarianism argument. And I think third and finally is this principle of rectification argument. So Robert Nozick, and I think almost all libertarians accept this trend of thought, which is that property, you only have legitimate rights to property if it was legitimately acquired. So, for example, if I like mug Martin in the street the next time that I see him, when is the next time I see you? Like Woodward? Yeah. So if I like mug Marshall or
in my card.
I mug Martin at Woodward and
Marshall, no.
Yeah. Oh, I've made this mistake like 3 times now. If I mug Martin and take his money, it's not legitimately mine. I acquired it using coercive force, which the libertarian is not okay with. And I think most people would sort of recognize that the history of America's wealth accumulation wasn't entirely done through just means. Like the most famous example, obviously, being the reason we fought the Civil War, which is slavery, means that there's a lot of reason to believe that property redistribution throughout the ages has not been just. And so that a universal basic income serves as a way to compensate people for the injustices that occurred through initial property acquisition. And the libertarian would be like, yeah, here's a universal basic income that solves the problem of having to figure out who owes what. And now we just figure that everyone gets some money, and that solves that problem.
Wow, that was like a super in-depth response. Let's move on to the second negative argument, which is laziness. I'll start with this one. So this is an argument that I heard a lot, and specifically because at the VBI camp that I was teaching rising novices, so people that had never debated before. Shout out to Yan Yan. And so they, in particular, came across a lot of arguments, or they wrote a lot of arguments about how the UBI was bad because it encouraged sloth. AKA, the UBI just says, you don't have to work in order to get paid. You don't have to work for your income. You get your income just by existing, which means that the only thing that you have to do in order to live is to exist. So this argument says that encourages a society where the default is that people exist rather than affect things, rather than work, rather than do things, rather than contribute to society. As such, society becomes worse, and it encourages kind of the worst in people, as people just only go about life trying to just sit there and survive rather than do other things. So that's my understanding of this argument. If you had to, Elana, if you had to talk about kind of the social, negative effects of sloth and stuff like that, how would you describe those happening?
Yeah, so one of the biggest fears about giving a UBI is that people just won't want to work, right? Imagine yourself, if you got a check coming in, every month or every few months, you might not be as motivated for money. So to answer your question, what would a society like that look like? And I'm trying to think if there's any examples of this, but I think it might be really interesting to think about this, for people learning about this topic. Think about this in terms of a classroom, right? Imagine that if you had, a bunch of assignments, and no matter what, if you did them, if you didn't do them, your teacher was going to give you an A, no matter what. Well, you can imagine what people would be doing with their time, right? They probably wouldn't be studying and working for their grades. So that's not a perfect analogy, but it kind of, situates and contextualizes this. So what would a society look like in the case of a UBI with slothiness? One of the people that, more libertarian would make this argument is that the thing that made this country so great in the first place was our work ethic, right? The fact that we came over with nothing from other countries, like for people that are immigrants, or even at our founding, right? We came as explorers, and we used our hard work and our American spirit to get where we are. And if we lose that, then not only do we have a community or a society where people might not be as appreciative of the opportunities that we have, but we also might lack innovation and lack the motivation to want to be creative and work hard And so we could see that, and that could actually be a big economic consequence as well.
Yep, that's pretty much what we want. So, Lawrence, what is the kind of criterion that you would maybe use with this, and does it rhyme with uh, utilitarianism?
Man, I'm just getting shoehorned into a type of person already. Like I'm
What's
just
what's your favorite criterion again, Lawrence? Will you
oh
say it again?
gosh.
Does it start with the U?
I actually don't even know if it's just like straight up utilitarianism. It's just some strand of consequentialism, and I've yet to determine which one it is. Anyways, so yeah, the utilitarian might have some problems with straight up laziness in this market-based society, which works because everyone, or at least the vast majority of people, participate and contribute. So like, yeah, that seems pretty straightforward to me. The utilitarian doesn't like the laziness.
Where would you find these kinds of arguments, Lawrence? Editorials, probably.
Yeah, there's a few studies actually about long-term incentives in work
Really
structures.
interesting.
Yeah, so, you'll find them like pretty scattered around the place because they've run these as sort of short-term simulations and short-term experiments, and people have been trying to really calculate like the incentives structures that exist and like the effects on actual work participation. So you'll find those around. A lot of the libertarian papers that we referenced above also like to cite work disincentives as a reason for like why it would be bad, and they just sort of throw that in there as an afterthought. It's pretty frequent. You're going to find this argument a bunch. If all of your novices found it, I'm sure everyone else can. So
Yeah, that is true. Okay, so responses to the laziness argument. So you mentioned, Lawrence, that there were some studies about work incentives and the universal basic income, or things like it. So this first response that we have to the universal basic income is just that actually universal basic income is net positive for work ethic in society. How might that be?
yeah, so start with two basic premises. Number one is that laziness is pretty high as it is now. So if the problem is that a welfare state that allows you to not work and still pays you is a problem, well, that kind of exists now to some extent. And premise number two is that it's pretty ambiguous in a lot of these studies whether or not there was actually this incentive effect. So, starting from these two premises, it makes it a little bit easier to make the claim that it improves work morale. And the reason for it is simple, right? Once you know that you aren't shoehorned into any profession that you want, and you have the economic freedom to choose to do things that you want to do, knowing full well that if you fail, there is a guaranteed social safety net for you, you're more likely to work in places that value you and that you value. And so it improves work morale.
Okay, so this argument answers the case on kind of just the fundamental contention level.
Yeah.
Which is that the effect will actually be the opposite. Now, this next one, Elana, contests the relevance of the argument. So this argument, which we have filed under "Who cares?" What is that, and why should we care?
Yeah, so this argument is kind of along the lines of the libertarian spirit. So, under libertarian thought, the idea is that the government really has no place to determine what people do with their time, what people do with their lives, right? People should kind of live as they want to live. And so the argument about who cares is the idea that if people, want to be lazy, then that should be their choice, right? The government shouldn't say that you shouldn't be allowed to be lazy. If you want to be the couch potato, then you should get to, right? And that's actually what libertarian thought says.
Yeah, and I think that one of the ways of looking at this is kind of related to what is the flip side of that, which is kind of authoritarian thought. So Ilana, in what way is it kind of authoritarian for the government to tell you that you shouldn't be allowed to be lazy if you want?
Yeah, this actually sounds like a really good premise for a good sci-fi movie. But the idea is that if the government has some kind of basic expectation about, you have to work or how much you have to work, not only is this a good opportunity for the more experienced debaters who are listening, right? You might think, oh, this sounds kind of like a good ableism argument or something along those lines. Obviously, capitalism argument as well. But just in general, This argument could be more authoritarian because now the government is telling you that your life is only worth living, or you're only allowed to be viewed as a citizen that is of quality and deserving of respect if you have a certain amount of work. And so the government's telling you how to live your life, what to do with your time. And that in itself is authoritarian and very controlling.
And another kind of that's definitely right. And another also way to look at this is that if the government is selecting the kind of people and that it wants on the basis of their like dispositions, their thoughts, like laziness as a thing that the governments can select for, is kind of a weird and authoritarian thing to select. So if the point is we want to not have people in our society, so it's one thing, and it is kind of authoritarian to say people in our society should only exist there if they work and contribute to society because of all the reasons that you just said. But it is also kind of weird and bad in a different sense if you want to say we as a society want a set of citizens who have the following characteristics on the inside. It is like kind of weird to select your citizens on the basis of personality traits like sloth. So
Exactly.
I think that is another way in which this argument is kind of contrary to all the things that it's trying to achieve. Okay, and the very last argument that we have is this is the arguments that we've talked about before. These are arguments about economic health. Lawrence, will you outline this argument for us?
So there's a few different versions of this argument, and they're all various reasons for why implementing a UBI would harm the overall economy. So the first one is just spending. So this is related to the funding concerns that we raised earlier, but the real question is like, how do we pay for literally everyone in the United States to receive some set amount of money? And it seems like most estimates will put this not in the billions, but in the trillions. And if you've never seen like a chart of like how much $1 trillion is in stacks of $100 bills, I'd recommend you look it up because it's actually kind of terrifying how large it is. And if we just spent another $1 trillion in like the next couple of years on top of the already massive amount of money that we're spending, there's a good chance that would actually just like wreck the economy, that it would just like take so much money out of the economy, put it straight into the government, and then we'd spend money that we just don't have, and it would just freak out the economy. So that's like the most popular version of this argument, which is that it's just too prohibitively expensive, can't put it into effect.
Spending, right?
Yeah, just straight up spending. The next argument is just like work ethic morale. That's the sort of laziness argument that we described above, that it would actually lead people to just do like worse in their job, and that would contribute to a worse economy. And then I think the final version of this argument is unemployment. There's good evidence to believe that if we were to implement this, that it would result in minimally a wage decline, that people would get paid less because, like they already like have tons of money. Companies would already have to pay more taxes, and so like the available pool of money to draw from to pay people would be less, and so people would probably get paid less overall, and that they would probably be unable to employ everyone that they want to employ, and so they would likely cut a lot of jobs. And there's a lot of economic studies that go back and forth on this, but a lot of them seem to indicate that implementing UBI would actually result in at least a few people losing their jobs.
Just another quick note. You could obviously use that as evidence for the laziness argument as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
If obviously unemployment, evidence of possible laziness. Okay, so if I wanted to put this argument together, Lawrence, the criterion, this would be very strictly utilitarian, obviously, right? We don't have to talk much more about that. So as far as researching this is concerned, this one is kind of like, you could find a lot of op-ed articles on it, but also there's a pretty large amount of scholarly resources as well, right, Lawrence?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because like this is a massive economic issue. So economic journals are going to focus more on this portion of the debate rather than the sort of values philosophical portion of this debate. So finding academic journals that narrow in on economic issues will be sort of your best bet for the gold standard of evidence on this.
like actually like studies of all too, right?
Yeah, because like a lot of these arguments are just sort of people like asserting that it would be expensive. Although that one doesn't really need a study. But like the stuff that is related to, for example, unemployment and inflation and other things like that, that requires someone that's smarter than a Washington Post op-ed writer, or at least more experience. Maybe not smarter, just like more
Yeah.
relevant experience in the field.
Not smarter, but who's like actually crunched the numbers.
Yeah, an expert perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, so Elana, let's talk about these two responses that we have to this argument. So number one is that it gets net money. Well, do you want to talk to us about how the economic health can actually improve as a result of a UBI?
Yeah, so if you look at one of the best arguments for UBI, it's the idea that it encourages entrepreneurship. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, how people are more willing to experiment and try new jobs if they do have this kind of cushion for universal basic income. So similarly, people are also more willing to experiment with and try out new entrepreneurial ideas, right? New businesses or new products. And so the idea is that if we give a universal basic income and we allow people to be more creative and be more entrepreneurial, then overall we might see an actual net increase in the amount of money that is available to the economy. So
So, so other than entrepreneurship, do you think that this is kind of just a generally applicable argument as a whole, other than just like the safety nets thing, which obviously makes sense to me? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think that the most interesting opportunity that this topic presents is that if debaters want, they can research a lot about the specifics in terms of the economic arguments, because there really isn't a decisive position, right, that social scientists and then economists have found about what a UBI would do, right? You can find a lot of conflicting data. And so if you wanted to, there's a lot of good studies out that shows that if we do have a UBI, then just overall, it would allow for more money in the economy. So absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This also kind of goes back to a lot of the stuff that we were discussing earlier on the flip side when we're talking about affirmative arguments. One thing that we kept saying was, oh, you could make arguments that the economy affects this or something like that. The same thing, but the opposite applies here. The first arguments that we talked about are inequality and poverty. And when we talked about both of those arguments, we mentioned how those things can be drains on the economy as well. So one of the easy responses that's kind of built into this, in addition to the entrepreneurship stuff, is also that we can say that things like poverty have negative pernicious effects on the economy. The existence of a pernicious and constantly existing wage gap or income gap, those things can have negative economic and social effects as well. So those things can be used to turn this case too. So, Lana, the second argument we have here says some things are more important than the economic health of the nation. So this has to do with the criterion then mostly, or the sort of priorities that the negative places here.
Yeah, exactly. So even if you look at a lot of debates right now in politics, people will kind of use the economy as a really big point to motivate political action, right? It's a really big selling point. We have to do this for the economy. But a big response that people in politics will use, or people in debate will use, is that there are things that are more important than the, quote, economic health of a nation, right? To make sure that our citizens are being taken care of, the human rights are being protected, that we're showing value to human dignity, that these are either a prerequisite concern or a priority that, we might not have perfect economic growth or perfect economic development. And instead we might have, a little bit slower growth or less development, but also demonstrate respect for a lot of basic rights.
Perfect. Okay, so when we return, we will go into our outro and have a mini debate. All right, thank you everyone for sticking with us, and thank you as well, Elana, for being such a great a great guest on our podcast. Thank you so much for devoting your time and coming on. You were really a great help.
Oh, thank you. Anytime, anytime.
Anytime. And thank you, Lawrence, for tolerating me for yet another week.
It's difficult, but I manage.
And vice versa. Okay, so thank you again to our sponsor, Victory Briefs, for hosting the podcast. They're really a premier debate camp, and you should totally check them out. You please go to our SoundCloud page and follow us, such that you will continue to get all of our things. Please leave an iTunes review so that we can climb the charts, even if it's give us 5 stars and then say your favorite or least favorite thing about me or Lawrence. And we will love you forever. And please sure to check our past episodes. We know that a lot of people listen to these topic analysis ones, but then don't listen to older ones. Please go to the Argument Clinic SoundCloud page for all of our past episodes. We have tons on a lot of really cool basic skills like weighing, efficiency, research evidence, persuasion, stuff like that. So there's really is a huge amount of resources available to you all on our page for free, and we all hope that you will please investigate those. Okay, so now on to the only important segment of our podcast, the mini debate. So how this is going to work, Elana, is I'm going to like propose a topic. Lawrence does not get to choose. I will make an argument in favor of something. Lawrence will make an argument in favor of something else. And you can choose to either support one of ours or provide a third opinion, and then we'll decide collectively who won. Okay,
right.
so this topic I have is favorite philosopher.
Oh.
So by favorite, I don't mean best. So you don't have to think that this philosopher is best, but you do have to think that this philosopher is wait, Lawrence, did we already do this topic? I forget.
I don't. If we have, it's been long enough that let's just do it again.
Okay, I'm gonna pick a different answer than what I picked the last time, if we even did it last time. Okay, so favorite philosopher, not necessarily the best philosopher, just like the philosopher that's like the coolest or whatever. So I'm gonna choose John Dewey. John Dewey is my favorite philosopher, not only because he was also a super good person and did things like found a certain set of schools in Chicago, and like he lived for like 100 years. There's this photo that I found of him, or that my philosophy professor found of him, which is him chopping wood at Nova Scotia at age like 90. So he's like he was like a social reformer. He was like a cool person, and he just would not take any of the stuff that people threw at him. He was a no nonsense kind of guy, and I think he's just like super cool as a person. And he's also my like Twitter picture. Is just like a very like sort of attractive picture of him with like, you know, black and white with glasses and whatever. So he's a good guy. All right, Lawrence, do you want to just immediately concede because you know you can never beat John Dewey?
Well, I believe actually we have done this topic. I did the last time. I think I picked Bentham because he was like a stuffed like corpse or something like that.
Oh yeah, you did. Maybe this time Elana can just.
No, I'm not going to go with Bentham this time. You know who I'm going with? I think this is a winner for no other reason than it's just like blatantly a troll. I'm going with Jake Niebel. That's my favorite philosopher.
What?
He is technically a philosopher because he received his bachelor in philosophy from Oxford in 2015. He was raved about by the one and only Peter Singer in his recommendation for the Marshall Scholarship, which got him there. And he has published works which I'm excited to card at some point in time, although I don't ever know when I'm going to get around to that. But I think Jake Niebel is obviously the best philosopher who's ever walked this planet. I think his picture is better than John Dewey's picture. No offense to John Dewey.
Okay. Elana, what have you got for us? Do you have a counter suggestion, or do you want to like jump onto one of these things?
Man, I mean, I had a counter suggestion, but Jake Niebel, that's going to be really hard to top. So, I mean, I am a philosophy major now at ASU, so There's a lot of good options to pick, right? I'm inclined to pick Seneca because I think Seneca is amazing, and I like the Stoics. I'm inclined to pick Socrates. I have a Socrates doll that sits in my room. Sometimes I bring him to class. But today, I have a very unique philosopher I think the viewers will really enjoy, or the listeners, I suppose. The listeners will enjoy hearing about him, Heraclitus, right? So Heraclitus was famously known for the phrase, "It's not possible to step twice into the same river." But what the viewers will find the most interesting about him is how he died. You guys know the story how he died?
It was like briefly mentioned in my
Maybe.
history of ancient philosophy class.
I forget. Tell us again.
Okay, so Heraclitus was diagnosed with a chronic illness, and his doctors could not find any kind of cure. So Heraclitus self-prescribed himself a very interesting treatment, and that is burying himself in dung. So he went to a field and covered himself like all the way up to the neck in manure and just sat in the hot sun, and he thought that that would cure him. But when he realized it wasn't working and tried to free himself, he couldn't free himself, and so he was trapped and he died. That is how he died.
Wow, that is that is certainly a very interesting way to go out. You know, you got to go out doing what doing what you love.
So yeah, I thought that was the most interesting story I've heard so far in college. So that's gotta share.
Okay, so I think we should settle this according to, well, so I don't know how John Dewey died. He was certainly very old. And I'm pretty sure Jake Nebel's still kicking. Last I checked. So I don't know if death is a good criteria. Lawrence, do you want to abandon ship to either?
I'm never
either
abandoning
Dewey?
Jake Nebel. How dare you?
Okay. Well, I will jump ship to Heraclitus because that story was funny, and I didn't know it ahead of
Thanks,
time.
Martin. Thank you.
So I'm sorry, but I'm sorry, John Dewey. I'll have to let you go. Heraclitus wins on 2 votes to 1. Sorry, Jake. Don't kill me.
Organs are funding for the podcast.
Okay. So Elana, the way that we close out all of the episodes of our podcast is we have someone say at the very end, they say "Stay Frosty," but they make the A really long in "stay." So if you would mind dismissing the podcast by saying that would be marvelous.
I would be honored to. Should I do it now?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Stay frosty.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.